India versus Pakistan. Just imagine you are in the biggest cricket stadium packed with fans of two different countries. On one side, you have the Indian fans draped in tricolor and chanting, "India! India!" On the other, the Pakistani fans waving their crescent moons and stars, countering with, "Pakistan Zindabad!" Now, imagine this rivalry is not just in the stadium, but spilling over into politics, history, and a shared cultural heritage that's as tangled as your headphone cords after a gym session. You see, our story begins in 1947 when India was under British rule. As independence loomed, religious tensions between Hindus and Muslims reached a boiling point, and this led to the creation of two separate nations: India, predominantly Hindu, and Pakistan, predominantly Muslim. Think of it as a messy breakup where one ex takes the music collection and the other takes the Netflix password. But just like splitting pizza between hungry teenagers, it wasn't a clean break. The region of Jammu and Kashmir, nestled between the two nations, became the main bone of contention, and both countries claimed it and did not have plans of letting the other guys get it. This started and led to a series of wars from 1947, 1965, 1971, and 1999, and countless skirmishes. The worst part is, the rivalry went beyond the battlefield and spilled into sports, especially cricket. Forget the World Cup, a match between India and Pakistan is like the Super Bowl of the subcontinent. However, over the decades, numerous attempts at peace talks have been made, but trust is a tricky thing to rebuild, and both sides are reluctant to make the first move. Currently, both countries have alternated between periods of chilly standoff and cautious engagement, but there's been more detours than a GPS glitch in a tomb. China versus Taiwan. Once upon a time in the early 20th century, China was having a bit of a rough patch. After a lot of internal chaos, two major political groups emerged: the nationalist Kuomintang, or KMT, and the communists. Picture it as a family divided between two wildly different ideologies, where one part loves a quiet, controlled home environment, while the other throws wild parties every weekend. Well, in 1949, after years of civil war, the communists, led by Mao Zedong, won the mainland, and the nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, fled to the island of Taiwan. Then, Big Bro Chin, representing the Communist Party, took control of the mainland, while Taiwan, repeating the Nationalist Party, set up camp on the island, both claiming to be the real China. It's like two people arguing over who's the real MVP of a family reunion. The worst part is that China then had the audacity to give Taiwan the silent treatment internationally, insisting that anyone who wanted to be friends with him couldn't even mention her name. Now, over decades, there have been multiple attempts to patch things up. Like in the 1990s, there were talks, a bit like family therapy sessions, but with diplomats instead of therapists. However, every time they get close to an agreement, one would storm out, slamming the door behind them. China was offering a one-country, two-systems model, basically telling Taiwan that it can keep the party gun lifestyle. All they need to do was admit they were the head. Well, Taiwan wasn't buying it because they offered the same to Hong Kong, and that didn't work out at all. Today, the situation is still unresolved because China insists Taiwan is part of its territory, while Taiwan keeps operating as a separate entity with its own government and everything. They're like those estranged siblings who show up to family gatherings but sit on opposite sides of the room pretending the other doesn't exist. North Korea versus South Korea. Picture two siblings who couldn't agree on anything, not even on how to cook instant noodles. Now turn that sibling spat into a decades-long, high-stakes global drama, and you've got North Korea versus South Korea, the most intense family feud in modern history. The drama all began after World War II, when Korea was freed from Japanese occupation. That meant the peninsula was divided at the 38th parallel, and with the Soviet Union taking the north and the United States taking the south. It was like splitting the room between two bickering siblings, and one got the communism toy set while the other got capitalism. Well, as it turns out, each side thought they had the winning strategy for happiness and prosperity. But it turns out they were both way too competitive to play nice. In the north, Kim Il-sung took charge, turning North Korea into a communist state with a leadership style that could make any dictator blush. And in the south, Syngman Rhee led South Korea with a focus on democracy and a market economy. The ideological tug of war was set, and things were about to get as spicy as a bowl of kimchi. Now, in 1950, North Korea under Kim Il-sung decided it was time for a family reunion by force, and they made the executive decision to invade South Korea. Well, this officially kicked off the Korean War, and it became like this huge sibling fight where each side called their bigger friends to help. The US and United Nations backed South Korea, while China and the Soviet Union supported North Korea. For years, the peninsula was a battleground, with both sides going back and forth like a game of tug-of-war on steroids. But in 1953, the war ended in an armistice, which is basically like, let's just stop fighting for now. So it wasn't a peace treaty, meaning technically they're still at war. Talk about holding a grudge. Israel versus Palestine. Picture two roommates living in a small apartment with one bathroom. But one roommate moved in first and claimed the whole bathroom as theirs because they found it first. However, the other one argues that their family has been using that bathroom for generations. Things get messy when both want to shower at the same time. Sounds intense, right? Well, welcome to the Israel-Palestine rivalry, but with a lot less showering and more historical baggage. This rivalry dates way back to the ancient times when both Jews, represented by Israel, and Arabs, represented by Palestine, claimed the land now known as Israel-Palestine as their ancestral home. The Jews' argument was basically saying they were promised this land by God, while Palestinians, who have obviously been living there for centuries, were not having that. Now, fast forward to the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Jewish people are facing persecution in Europe, so they begin migrating back to what they called their ancestral homeland. But surprise, surprise, Palestinians were already there, sipping tea and living their best lives. Naturally, things get a bit awkward, and just like that, 2 + 2 = war. Then, the plot thickens in 1947 when the United Nations, playing the role of the overwhelmed landlord, decided to split the land into 2 states, one for the Jewish called Israel and one for the Arabs called Palestine. It was like a poorly thought-out roommate agreement where both sides felt cheated. Israel declared itself a state in 1948, and neighboring Arab countries supporting Palestine declared war. The war ended with Israel controlling most of the land and a lot of Palestinians displaced and feeling robbed. However, over the decades, this conflict turned into a game of tug-of-war with very deadly consequences. And even though several attempts at peace have been made, the conflict is still like an on-again, off-again relationship. United Kingdom versus Ireland. Back in the day, the British Empire was like that one relative who always grabs the biggest share of the pie. In the 12th century, England decided to take a little field trip to Ireland, but instead of souvenirs, they brought soldiers. This marked the beginning of English dominance in Ireland, and over the centuries, tensions simmered like a pot of stew left on the stove too long. First it was religious differences, then it was the land disputes, and a whole lot of "we want independence." The religious bit was particularly spicy, especially because England was mostly Protestant, while Ireland remained predominantly Catholic. This religious divide became one of the main points of contention as England was trying to enforce Protestantism in Ireland, which went down as well as a lead balloon. Fast forward to the 19th and early 20th centuries, and Ireland was fed up. The Irish decided they wanted their country back, and this officially led to the Irish War of Independence from 1919 to 1921. After some intense fighting, both sides decided they needed a break. The Anglo-Irish Treaty of 1921 was signed, leading to the establishment of the Irish Free State in 1922, which had its own government but remained a dominion of the British Empire. It's like when you storm off from the family table but agree to come back as long as you sit at the kiddie table with some freedom. But then here's where things get tricky. The treaty wasn't a clean break. 6 countries in the north, which had a majority of people who were Protestant and wanted to stay with the UK, became Northern Ireland, and the rest became the Republic of Ireland. This partition led to more tension, especially in Northern Ireland, where Catholics felt discriminated against. This led to the Troubles, a period of conflict from the late 1960s to 1998. Eventually, after decades of tension and violence, both sides realized that maybe, just maybe, they could stop throwing pies at each other and start talking. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 was a major step toward peace, and it allowed for a developed government in Northern Ireland with power sharing between Unionists, those who wanted to stay with the UK, and Nationalists, those who wanted to join a united Ireland. Greece versus Turkey. So it's another bright and sunny day in the Mediterranean, and once again, Greece and Turkey, the neighbors who've been at each other's throats for centuries, are once again arguing. And this time around, they're fighting over territory, national identity, and, believe it or not, who's got the better historical claim to certain pieces of land and sea. But this war didn't just start now. It started during the Ottoman Empire days, when Turkey pretty much ran the show. Greece, on the other hand, was just one of the many nations under Ottoman rule. But like that one kid who's had enough of the older sibling bossing them around, Greece decided to break free in the early 19th century. This kicked off the Greek War of Independence of 1821 to 1830. And after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears, and some help from other European powers, Greece got its independence. Fast forward to the 20th century, and things still weren't cool at all. Because the end of World War I saw the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and Greece saw an opportunity to grab some more land, especially in Anatolia, which you know today as modern-day Turkey. This once again led to a bloody war called the Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. And after all the brutality, the war ended with the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which drew the boundaries we mostly see today. Well, after many decades of war, peace didn't exactly come with a big group hug. It was more like a let's agree to disagree situation. Various treaties and agreements over the years have tried to keep the peace. NATO membership helped too, since both countries are in the alliance. Efforts have also been made to ease tensions, like the 1999 earthquake diplomacy, where both nations helped each other after devastating earthquakes. This showed that, despite the rivalry, they could still be decent neighbors when disaster struck. Armenia versus Azerbaijan. Let's rewind the clock to the early 20th century, when Armenia and Azerbaijan were still part of a large empire called the Soviet Union. These guys were sort of strict parents who kept the siblings from fighting too much. Then Nagorno-Karabakh, this picturesque mountainous region, was placed under Azerbaijani control, even though they were majorly populated by Armenians, and of course this did not sit well with the Armenians at all. So once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, it was like the parents went on vacation and left the kids home alone. Armenia and Azerbaijan rushed to the garden, Nagorno-Karabakh, and claimed it for themselves. And just like that, a full-blown war erupted. This happened between 1991 and 1994, and it was brutal. Imagine a food fight in the cafeteria, but with no teachers to stop it, and instead of mashed potatoes, they were using actual weapons. Thousands of people lost their lives, and many were displaced from their homes. And by 1994, Armenia had taken control of Nagorno-Karabakh and some surrounding areas, though it was internationally recognized as part of Azerbaijan. And even though an uneasy truce was brokered, it was like putting a band-aid on a broken arm. Now, almost 10 years later, that band-aid was ripped off again because in 2020, Azerbaijan wanted a rematch. This time, they had better weapons and a lot of drones. The fighting was swift and deadly, and by the end of the 6-week war, Azerbaijan had regained control of much of the territory. It was a classic case of you live to fight another day. Eventually, in November 2020, with Russia playing the role of the reluctant mediator, another peace agreement was signed. Azerbaijan got to keep the territories it regained, and Russian peacekeepers were deployed to monitor the situation. Serbia versus Croatia. Just imagine living next door to someone who shares your love for barbecues, but constantly insists on blasting their least favorite music during your family gatherings. Now, amplify that by 100 years of history, a splash of nationalism, and a few wars, and you've got the Serbia-Croatia rivalry. It's like a soap opera, but with real stakes and a lot more drama. But to really understand the Serbia-Croatia rivalry, we need to take a quick trip back in time. Think of it like Game of Thrones, Balkans, but with more Slavic names and fewer dragons. You see, Serbs and Croats were under different rulers for centuries. Serbia was under the Ottomans, while Croatia was chilling under the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Different rulers, different cultures, and a brewing identity crisis. It was like being raised by two wildly different parents. Now, fast forward to World War II, where things got more intense than a reality TV show finale. Croatia had a Nazi-aligned puppet state, while Serbia resisted the Axis powers and had strong resistance movements. But the war scars left during this fight would set the stage and fester into all the other future conflicts these two nations faced. Well, after the war, another country called Yugoslavia was created under the leadership of Josip Broz Tito, and this brought together 6 republics, including Serbia and Croatia. It was like forcing a bunch of high school rivals to work on a group project. Spoiler alert, It didn't end well. Because even though things were civil under the rule of Tito, when he passed away, the unity crumbled faster than a cookie in milk. By the 1990s, nationalism surged and Croatia declared independence. Serbia, not ready to part ways peacefully, saw this as a betrayal. The result was a series of conflicts, particularly between Serbia and Croatia from 1991 to 1995. The wars were brutal, marked by ethnic cleansing, sieges, and countless atrocities. Both sides accused each other of war crimes, and the war left a legacy of destruction and bitterness. Imagine the worst family argument you've ever had, then multiply it by 1,000 and throw in tanks and international condemnation. Thankfully, in 1995, the war officially ended with the signing of the Dayton Agreement. But peace was like putting a Band-Aid on a broken leg. Better than nothing, but the underlying issues weren't fully resolved. Today, Serbia and Croatia are like those estranged siblings who make polite conversation at family gatherings. There are still disputes, especially regarding history and minority rights, but there's also cooperation in areas like trade and tourism. Both nations have their eyes on a future in the European Union, which could serve as the common ground they need to finally let bygones be bygones. United States versus Russia. So, it's the late 1940s, and the world just survived World War II. You'd think after this, everyone would have been ready for peace and quiet. But instead of sipping martinis and rebuilding, two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, aka Russia's squad, starts giving each other the stink eye across the globe. And the root of this chilly conflict was literally just a clash of ideas. To put it simply, the US wanted a world where people could own businesses, eat as many hamburgers as they liked, and watch TV shows about how to be rich, while the Soviet Union dreamed of a place where everyone shared everything equally except, well, the government, which kept the best stuff and watched TV shows about how everyone was equally happy. So it was essentially a fight between capitalism and communism. As if the drama wasn't enough, the Soviet launched Sputnik, the first satellite into space in 1957, and it felt like a slap to the US government. So, in order not to be outdone, the US replied with their own space missions, culminating in 1969 when Neil Armstrong took that famous small step for man, giant leap for mankind on the moon. It was the ultimate game of who's got the cooler toys, except the toys were rockets and the playground was the universe. Eventually, the rivalry hit its iciest moment during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union guys parked some missiles in Cuba, which was just 90 miles from US shores, and this made the US feel a bit uncomfortable. President John F. Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev played a tense game of chicken, and after 13 nail-biting days, Khrushchev blinked first, agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for the US promising not to invade Cuba. Well, by the 1980s, after almost 10 years of unnecessary fighting, both sides were exhausted. They had spent trillions on weapons and espionage, and their economies were feeling the strain. And when Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet leader with a cool birthmark and even cooler ideas, came into power, he dissolved the Soviet Union in 1991, and this marked the end of the Cold War.